Hello, this is Chapter 10 review. We just discussed the early republic. Now we're going to talk about an era of transition in the United States. The big theme for this transition is moving towards more commercialism, towards more commerce. The values of the United States begin to shift from primarily concerned with the limitation of government power and the distribution of power among the states to making the country more efficient for economic growth. A part of that will be a much higher priority on individual Americans' desire to improve their economic status. The idea that the United States is now a place for tremendous opportunity when it comes to wealth, that you could potentially start from being poor and eventually be very rich. This is sort of the birth of that as being an American value. And with that comes a lot of very, very important but also very poorly understood changes to American values permanently. So like materialism, which people tend to narrowly define materialism and only include the most extreme examples, people who are very conspicuously status obsessed. But materialism really is, if you define your aspirations or what you want out of life, if you define who you want to be in terms of what you own, your house, other types of possessions, that is materialism. It's unavoidable in our current society. Everyone is necessarily materialist, even if they may not want to be. We're going to cover some other key issues during this time, but that is sort of the driving force behind all of it. So let's talk about the issue of slavery. Slavery, we're talking about the early 1800s to early 19th century. Slavery will become one of the most important national issues for the first time. Before, slavery was just one of those awkward things that the founding fathers and many Americans tried to reconcile with the ideals about freedom and inalienable rights and all those things. There was not a large movement of people who thought that slavery was bad and that it should be changed. Though there were those who believed that slavery was immoral, that was not the primary reason for the debate on the extension of slavery to Western states. So westward expansion, which is also a very important topic during this time, brings slavery to the forefront as a controversy. So slavery does not become a major issue in American history during this time for primarily moral reasons, but instead for political reasons, which we will get into. Now, the reason that westward expansion has anything to do with slavery being a much more controversial issue is that there are states who will eventually outlaw slavery. There will be states who increasingly rely on slavery for their economic success, and the states who rely on slavery for economic success become more and more paranoid that if they're eventually outnumbered by states who do not value slavery, that their livelihoods will be destroyed. Importation of slaves was outlawed in the year 1808. But the federal government had no legal authority to reduce slavery in any other way. Missouri Compromise. Southern economies, their power rested on agriculture. The nature of the agriculture in the South was largely dependent on slave labor. So since the North's economies did not depend on slavery, the North was generally hostile to the expansion of slavery in new states. And notice I'm specifying expansion of slavery. Very few in the North made the argument that it was practical to end all slavery. I mean, some did, but it was not mainstream. Typically, the argument was, we don't need to expand slavery. It's something that, we're a little embarrassed of. Yes, we understand that there are certain states that need it now, but there's no good reason to spread it. Let's at least not expand it. This resistance to the expansion of slavery made southern states worried that unless future states out west were also slave states, the slave states in the South would eventually be outnumbered. And then tyranny of the majority would set in, and the other states who had no use for slavery would vote to remove it. And then southern economies and the southern way of life, as it was at the time, would collapse. So you see the interest that the South had in expanding slavery wasn't necessarily because they thought that slavery was good for the rest of the world. I'm sure plenty made that argument, no matter how awkward it may have been. But the real thing was it was anticipating a future scenario where there would be so many more free states than slave states that the free states could easily meet the requirements in the Constitution to make a constitutional amendment to outlaw slavery, and there's nothing the slave states could do about it because they would be outnumbered. So anyway, that was the concern. That was the different perspectives at the time. The reason it's the Missouri Compromise is this issue sort of came to a head when Missouri was up for statehood. When I say up for statehood, obviously states that were added to the Union were done so as part of a process. They had to meet a certain population threshold, and as each territory did that, then they would apply for statehood and they would go through the process and then eventually become a state. Well, it just so happened that this issue comes to the forefront whenever Missouri is up for statehood. So a deal was made that all future states north of the Missouri border would be free states. Essentially, that kicked the can down the road, meaning that it wasn't a permanent solution. It was just trying to release the pressure from a constitutional crisis coming at that time. Said, all right, we'll let future generations handle this instead of dealing with it now. So it did calm people down for a while, but the issue is only going to grow more controversial and more heated over time. The longer it goes, the worse it becomes. But let's talk about Monroe's presidency and the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe, his presidency was significant in that it involved a lot of foreign policy successes. That is, as the United States is growing, as it becomes more commercialized, which, if you remember, that means that the city-dwelling Federalists back in the day, their vision for America won out despite the fact that they were fewer in number. There was a treaty with Spain that basically secured and extended America's western border. Adams on this treaty. Relations with Britain were improving following their latest war. But perhaps the most important thing established by Monroe, which will actually live on as a permanent fixture of American foreign policy, you'll hear people bring it up now, though completely out of context. But anyway, this is known as the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the United States promised in late 1823 that it would not interfere with already existing colonial possessions in the Western Hemisphere, European colonial possessions. So in other words, the Monroe Doctrine was a declaration that current European colonies in the Western Hemisphere, the United States has no intention of bothering them. However, and this is really the important part, Europeans were never again to meddle in the politics of any other country in the Western Hemisphere. So trying to take a new colony or trying to become deeply involved in domestic politics in order to maybe overthrow a government and make it dependent on a European state. There's any number of ways that European countries, using their banks or anything else, could gain more influence and power over people in the Western Hemisphere. That is North, Central, South America. So the United States is saying, no, that's it. You've reached your limit. You're not doing it anymore. So Monroe established that the United States would have a sphere of influence in North and South America and warned that any attempt by Europe, any European nation, any attempt to interfere would be considered a hostile act. Okay, so now we're going to get to that whole big change in commercializing the United States. And the section here is the new national market. So that's an important phrase to be comfortable with. Now, before the War of 1812, the United States was a country mostly populated by independent farmers who owned their own property and grew most of what they needed. Remember, semi-subsistence. But the changes that we've discussed about the growing influence of the commercial class, the merchants, the manufacturers, the economic elite, as they gain more power and as they affect more changes in the American government, then the country becomes a more friendly place to business. As that happens and as economic opportunity continues to accelerate, you start to see an uprooting of that traditional system. You see a little bit more people move to cities, still nowhere near as many that live in the countryside. You see more people turning to materialism. You see more people turning to trying to get rich. From the 18 teens, so like 1813 to around 1850, this is when you're going to see this transition. The population continued to grow rapidly. The population of cities grew much faster than the population out in the country, which means that a slow shift occurs, not only in demographics, but also in priorities for the government. In other words, focus primarily on protecting individual liberty versus focused primarily on economic opportunity. So the needs of those city dwellers, which were already a force in American politics, became even more dominant. Industrialization is also going to change things. That's going to be a big topic we cover towards the end of the semester. Well, we're really pretty much at the end of the semester, but so let's go ahead and talk about industrialization now. So what is industrialization? Industrialism is a new, more efficient way to produce goods. So industrialism is a very complicated, comprehensive subject, but it helps to be able to boil it down to what is the kernel of all of this, what is the core element of it, and it is a new, more efficient way to produce goods, which sounds really simple, but that simple thing has countless repercussions. What this meant was this more efficient way to produce goods, instead of relying on highly trained labor, so skilled labor, to make one item at a time, certain processes and eventually factories will be set up so that most of the thinking was not done by the actual artisans, but instead it was done by the designers of the process, the designers of the factories, and the designers of an assembly line. So what that means is a system was created so that unskilled labor, which is easier to replace, by the way, was able to make things faster, cheaper, and nearly the same quality, but not quite, as highly trained, highly skilled labor before. Now, of course, certain technology was necessary to do this, as machines were eventually made to do most of the work, and then eventually, only just cooperation and maintenance was needed by humans. And of course, this changed much more than just the amount of goods produced. It made the amount of money that a company could make exponentially more. Instead of, due to limitations of time and resources, companies could only sell locally before. Now, after industrialization and during industrialization, companies can make much more products to be sold. They can, thanks to changes in infrastructure, which we'll talk about later, like the railroad eventually. But at first it's going to be things like canals and dirt roads and paths through woods and things like that, but usually canals. Thanks to those things, the companies will be able to ship their goods further out to more people. You can only make so much money if you sell things to people in your town. If something changes, or a few things change to make it possible to sell things to everyone in your state, then the amount of money that can be made by that same company explodes higher. And then if you can do that with your whole country or even the whole world, then you see the amount of money that can centralize into one company is massive. And because the system that exists in the United States is capitalism, which means that, the owners, the shareholders, which we'll talk about that later. If you don't already know what that means, don't worry about it. Only the owners get to keep the profits, and everyone else is paid a wage for their work, like a paycheck. This means that you're going to see in the United States a explosion of inequality. Before, when the vast majority of Americans were farmers and they didn't own large companies, and even the few rich Americans that did exist before industrialization, they relied on skilled labor. They relied on relatively poor infrastructure. It was not even possible to trade goods, commodities to a huge number of people. So those types of things limited the amount of money that certain people could make. Of course, in Britain, where industrialization kicked off sooner, there were massively wealthy industrialists, massively wealthy people, and then you had an army of poor peasants. Not literally an army, but a horde, an ocean of poor. Eventually, that's going to happen in the United States, and it's during this era where that transition takes place. Radical changes to society. So what are some of those changes? You're going to see more people, the country's going to become more urban, less rural. Now, it's not until the 1920s when you actually have more people living in cities than out in the country, but that change, that shift begins in earnest at this time. You see more of a dependence on unskilled labor rather than skilled labor. If you think about all the implications there, that means that a person is more replaceable. You're going to see Americans going from more independent and valuing self-sufficiency to being dependent on a job, on the economy, on eventually the government. Americans were generally very independent, very self-sufficient. Things like personal responsibility were highly valued, And then as the United States changes and becomes more commercialized, becomes, capitalism sort of changes inequality and things like that, you see the standard of living going up and people have more money and more things, but they're dependent on the system in order for that to continue. And that means that if something bad happens, then individuals are far more susceptible to being dragged down. So if you remember, we talked about at a certain point in American history, no one cared about the economy. As more people moved to the cities and left the countryside, those cities became even more important to American society, politics, and the economy. How might values change? How might politicians adjust to that? How would the economy change? So before the War of 1812, American industry was small, and its success and growth depended on foreign markets. Agriculture and harvesting natural resources still dominated the economy. So at the same time that advancements in technology made it easier and cheaper to produce goods, there was a big population boom in the United States. And this meant that more people could afford more goods. And so demand drives economic growth. As infrastructure improved, which is, roads, but primarily river transport, canals, bigger ports, it became easier for products to reach consumers in the former backcountry. And so all of these factors combined to create a synergy. So during all these changes, it became actually possible for regular people to make it rich. As a result, more people became increasingly likely to be driven by the prospect of getting rich. And what does getting rich mean in this context? Acquiring more material goods, material possessions, status. So the United States became a land of individuals all competing over the opportunity of advancement. And competition was not frowned upon. So in this scenario where you have Americans really thirsty for getting rich, the American economy will become more important to nearly everyone, and it will become volatile, prone to booms and busts, booms being awesome times, busts being really bad times. So there's also a rise in the amount of people who used money to make money. Capitalism, that is, instead of making money by creating something or providing a service, you make money by investing money in something that's already making money, and then you make money as a result of that. So essentially attaching money or capital to other things or someone else's things and getting money from that. So it's a new way to make money, which early on a lot of Americans despised, saw it as a dishonest way to make money. This becomes normalized in American society. It's also known as speculation. So because of this appetite for success in the growing American economy and the introduction of a new way of life that accompanied industrialization, the United States became a very different place with a very different version of values. Capitalism quickly became considered at the heart of those sacred American values. Where Jeffersonian democracy had once rested on the values of agriculture and that of the independent farmer, now you have acquiring wealth, a chance to make it rich, a land of opportunity that will slide in and start to replace it. Another thing that's changing during this time is the United States is going to have a little bit more democracy. If you remember, nearly all of the founding fathers distrusted the idea of democracy. They actually saw it as a negative word. A democracy didn't mean freedom, it just meant chaos to pretty much all the founding fathers. The country's going to become more democratic. That means more people will have political influence and political participation. Since the values of capitalism had spread over the whole country, politics adapted. So Republicans who had formerly resisted a role for the government in the economy because they distrusted federal power, now they happily established additional roles for the government and increased its influence in the economy for the sake of national economic growth. So really those who prioritized national economic growth over all else dominated the American government, and it will change as a result. So this was done as Federalists had insisted for the past generation to promote economic growth and national power. And this idea can be rolled into a concept, sometimes it's called New Nationalism. Now, along with this New Nationalism came a general increase in federal power over local government. Chief Justice John Marshall, in a series of court decisions against state governments, established federal power over states and made it clear that the state governments were now solidly under the reigning power of the federal government whenever it came to things like regulation of commerce. Some important cases there, Gibbons versus Ogden, Dartmouth versus New Hampshire. I can provide some info about those, but I don't want to get too bogged down. But it's another major step in this commercialization of the United States. Let's talk about the transport revolution. So, of course, in order for industrialization and this new commercial country to take hold, you have to have infrastructure. If you had a factory that could build 1 million products in a month, and because of no roads or no canals and no way to get it to people, you can only sell half of that, then you've actually lost a lot of money. You're limited by infrastructure. It can become a bottleneck. That's what the transportation revolution is about. So a country the size of the United States can't have a national market without a good transportation system. If you can only move your product 100 miles, then you're going to have less customers than if you could move your product 300 miles. Pretty basic stuff. So faster and more efficient transportation made possible by investments from a stronger national government and the advancement of technology made the national economy much stronger, much larger. So there's an important stat that's from your textbook. The cost of overland transportation will drop 95% during this era, and it will speed up 5 times, meaning 5 times faster overland transportation than before this era began. And that's a 30-year time span we're talking about. So that is a revolutionary change. It's not just an upgrade. That's a life-changing situation. Now, canals and steamboats were an important part of this early on, as they drastically cut the cost of transporting people and goods between major economic centers. Railroads will eventually become the dominant mode of transportation, but that's not until 1850. Until then, canals and steamships will allow the United States to grow economically much faster than ever before. All right, so let's talk about changes in agriculture. Due to all this infrastructure improvement, now that farm families were more linked to one another and the people they fed, they became more aware of the system that they were a part of. So they became more active in trying to improve that system from their perspective. In other words, a lot of farmers, if you remember, their big priority was, well, the government should just leave me alone. Since the government was absolutely being taken in the opposite direction and the country was becoming, this new nationalization was sort of forcing the country to be more integrated. That is, what a person did on this part of the country now affected a person in the other part of the country, whether or not those two people wanted to affect one another. For that reason, farmers are going to become more politically active. So thanks to advances in transportation, now more crops could be sold. Before advances in transportation, many farmers would only grow what they could sell to people in their community or maybe surrounding communities. Now that national and even international markets were open, thanks to technology and changes in government, you see the size and number of farms grow tremendously out in the former frontier. So now, being a farmer in these new territories, like with the Louisiana Purchase, that becomes an economic opportunity. So it's not just an opportunity for a family to go out and be independent and have their own possessions and their own farm. It's an opportunity maybe to make a good living for yourself by selling your surplus. So again, this represents a transition from subsistence agriculture to commercial agriculture. I've mentioned this new emphasis in the government. So during this phase of American economic growth, all 3 branches of government supported big business and adjusted the government's responsibility to facilitator of growing business. So where the Founding Fathers' focus was liberty and the protection of individual rights, the overwhelming focus on the generation of the second quarter of the 1800s, that is 1825 to 1850, was the growth of American business enterprise. So let's talk about population growth. The birth rate of the United States was extremely high during this time. 4 million Americans in 1790 turned into 23 million Americans in about 60 years' time. So while natural growth had explained the previous population increases in American history, by the 1820s there was a massive influx of immigrants. So during the 1820s, over 500,000 people moved to the United States. The result of this immigration was a change in American culture. So direct access to German, Irish, English, Scandinavian, Italian, and other foreign cultures are going to diversify American cities and create a rare situation when you compare it to the rest of the world. This wasn't something that happened in other countries. Countries were typically very racially homogenous, culturally, ethnically homogenous. Now, a higher percentage of Americans than ever before will live in cities during this era. It's important to note, though, that the United States was still mostly rural by the 1840s. Your book gives you a good ratio here. The ratio of farmers to city dwellers dropped from 15 to 1, that is 15 farmers to one person living in a city, down to 5.5 to 1. So that's a tremendous change. All the advances in technology we discussed made this urbanization possible. Larger farms meant more surplus, which meant more food for those who rely on shipments. Nowadays, nearly everyone relies on food shipments. That's an example of how today, if supply chains shut down, there would be a massive problem and probably starvation, and then all the other horrible social side effects of something like starvation in a massive city. Back then, if something happened to disrupt the supply chains, much less people would be affected. It's important to remember that the way our society is set up now, we are reliant, totally reliant on the technology, on the innovation that has allowed for this to become possible. If it goes away, it's not just like, oh, okay, well, we don't have as much variety. It's if things break down, it could be very serious consequences. Anyway, so since the United States was such a large and diverse place, some sections of the country urbanized more than others. The Northeast was the most, and the Southeast was the least. If you remember, the South was making a lot of money from agriculture. For those who were already rich in the South, they did not see any reason to start engaging in new industry and new assembly line, new factory processes. They were looking into just protecting what they had. Whereas the North, which was not reliant on agriculture and absolutely needed other methods of income and economic success, they went fully into manufacturing and these new industrialized processes, which of course is just going to further exacerbate political tension between the North and the South because their lifestyles, their values, their objectives, the way that they make money and stay rich primarily are so different. The last section here, a rise in materialism and status obsession. Now, as industrialism set in and a middle class developed, more and more people had a chance to obtain goods for other purposes than just subsistence. Now that people living in larger cities were more often in contact with one another, material possessions became a popular way for people to have pride in themselves. Because if you think about it, there's not as much opportunity to have pride in your work. If you work at, and of course bicycles came much later, but let's just use it for an example. Let's say you work at a bicycle shop, okay? And the miracle of the factory that you work at is that they can make bicycles much cheaper because instead of having one person put it all together, which takes a certain amount of time and you have to pay that person a lot of money because there's not many people who can replace highly skilled labor. Now you work in a place and your job is to put the spokes in a wheel. And you do that all day. That's your only job. And if you do it that way, then the company can make same quality bicycles faster and for less cost. But you're stuck with just that job. So it's much more difficult to have pride in, hey, how many spokes I did today, than it would be if you're managing your own farm with the diverse range of things that you're responsible for, the sense of pride. I don't know if you've ever put together any IKEA furniture or something. It's not hard for us to actually feel proud of ourselves for accomplishing something with our hands or something that we've done ourselves or we created. But it's much more difficult if you have a menial task and you get a flat wage for it and someone else is getting most of the benefit of your work. Since it's still important for people to have pride in themselves, to feel self-worth, there are other less natural ways for people to compensate for that, and that is, surrounding yourself with possessions. And so for that reason, materialism, status obsession becomes much more important in American history during this time. It's no accident. Now, visitors from other countries and intellectuals from the era, they're going to write about this, and so achievement became overwhelmingly associated with owning stuff more than doing things. So Alex de Tocqueville, a traveling writer, a philosopher, a very highly educated man of letters from France, he visited the United States and he wrote books, Democracy in America, probably the most famous of them. But I have a quote from him as he is analyzing American society, American culture in 1831 and 1832. And here's what he had to say. So I'm just going to read the quote from him. And again, this is 1832, quote, "There is indeed a most dangerous passage in the history of a democratic people. when the taste for physical gratifications among them has grown more rapidly than their education and their experience of free institutions, the time will come when men are carried away and lose all self-restraint at the sight of possessions they are about to obtain. In their intense and exclusive anxiety to make a fortune, they lose sight of the close connection that exists between the private fortune of each and the prosperity of all. It is not necessary to do violence to such a people in order to strip them of the rights they enjoy. They themselves willingly loosen their hold. The discharge of political duties appears to them to be a troublesome impediment which diverts them from their occupations and business. So, very clear that once it becomes possible for a regular person to obtain wealth, then that will become their overriding concern, and that as long as their ability to obtain wealth is there, then their interest in freedom, personal liberty, and of course their vigilance goes away. And so de Tocqueville is saying that if you have a society with a high standard of living, then they're probably not going to pay much attention to what their government is doing as long as that standard of living is high. And history, American history, has absolutely demonstrated that. I've polled my students every semester that I've been teaching for 10 years, and I've never had more than one student ever even claim to have read a single bill by the federal government, the law. That the way they find out about bills is through the news, or they'll see maybe a headline or read a paragraph or two about what it is, and they'll hear people argue about it maybe on television news, but that actually checking independently what's going on in the government doesn't happen. So I'll leave you with one more quote by Alex de Tocqueville, and this is from Democracy in America. Quote, "Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate." He's talking about the government. "That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood. But it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that the people should rejoice, provided they think of nothing but rejoicing. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and the only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of property, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living? Thus, it every day renders the exercise of the free agency of man less useful and less frequent. It circumscribes the will within a narrower range, and gradually robs a man of all the uses of himself. The principle of equality has prepared men for these things. It has predisposed men to endure them, and oftentimes to look on them as benefits. After having thus successively taken each member of the community in its powerful grasp, and fashioned them at will, the supreme power then extends its arm over the whole community. It covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and most energetic characters cannot penetrate to rise above the crowd. The will of man is not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. Men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to be nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd.